Hi, welcome to my channel Cloud with Girish. In the previous video workshop, I demonstrated how to secure your CloudFront distribution or website using AWS WAF. I also covered how to send custom response code and messages using AWS WAF, as well as how to rate limit an API endpoint with WAF. Additionally, there was a tutorial on rate limiting with a URI path as a scope down statement, allowing for more fine-grained control over the rule. If you missed it, be sure to check out the tutorial linked in the description before continuing. In this video, I will demonstrate another use case implementing IP whitelisting using AWS WAF. With this use case, only the IP listed in the IP set for AWS WAF will have access to resources like API endpoints. If API endpoint is accessed from an IP not listed in the IP set, it will get a 403 forbidden response and access to the endpoint will not be provided. Here is our business use case, implementing IP whitelisting using AWS WAF. Create an IP set, create a rule that uses this IP set to determine if access to the API endpoint should be granted. If the rule is triggered, return 403 forbidden response. I will be creating the AWS WAF WebACL and rules using AWS console. However, you can create the AWS WAF rules using CloudFormation as well. Let's look at our architecture. We have a consumer that wants to invoke the API hosted in the API gateway, and this API is utilizing a serverless function which is Lambda, and Lambda is integrating with the DynamoDB that has the data stored. So based on the request, data will be created or retrieved from the DynamoDB using the API. We are putting a AWS WAF in front of the API gateway, and there is a rule which is using a IP set. IP set has the IP listed which are whitelisted, and if IP is not whitelisted, then access to this API will not be provided. Ensure that you have reviewed the prior workshop on AWS WAF. Here are the links to the different workshops that have been completed on WAF. Let's get started. We're going to do a quick review of AWS WAF service, key resources to protect the core component, the example use case, configuring the WebACL. We're going to create an IP set with the list of IP to be whitelisted, setting up rule that uses this IP set, and then we'll associate the AWS resource, which in this case, in particular use case, the resource is the AWS API gateway, since our API is hosted using the API gateway. We will validate the solution. I will access the API endpoint using Postman, and then WAF rule will trigger and access will be allowed if it is from the whitelisted IP. At the end, we will do a resource cleanup. So we will remove the CloudFront association, we will delete the rule, we will delete the WebACL, and we will do this cleanup just so we don't incur the ongoing charges in our AWS account. So let's look at the WAF service. AWS WAF is a fully managed web application firewall service provided by AWS. It simplifies the process of protecting the web resources by allowing you to define WebACL, the access control list, and custom rules, or by using pre-configured rule from the AWS marketplace. Once set up, AWS WAF safeguard your web application based on the specified rule. The key component of WAF are WebACL, rules, and rules group. Now, multiple rules can be applied, and the priority of those rules can be adjusted if you have multiple rules. Rule action can be allow, block, count, and few others. Rule group is a collection of rules. We can build our own rule group, or we can buy pre-built rule group from Amazon Marketplace. Now, of course, if we're buying pre-built group, there is a cost associated with that. Nothing is free. So in this case, assess for your use case, benefit, and pricing. These are the services which are supported by AWS WAF at the time of creating this video in October of 2024. So CloudFront, API Gateway, Application Load Balancer, Cognito User Pool, App Sync, and App Runner are the services which are supported by AWS WAF. As you can see in this diagram, there are various use cases that we can fulfill by attaching AWS WAF with any of these supported resources. So let's talk about a few of the use cases that we can support by using the AWS WAF. So some of the use cases are, one popular one is the protect from DDoS attack at a layer 7 level. There is another service that AWS provides, the AWS Shield Advanced, and that is used for DDoS protection at layer 3. Implement geo restriction. We can build rule around implementing IP restriction, implement the rate limit for API or any other resource for that matter, protection from SQL injection, and several other use cases. Since we're talking about layer 7 and layer 3, I thought that I provide a quick review of OSI layer that I'm sure that if you are in computer engineering field, you probably remember the OSI layer from your engineering classes. There are 7 layers starting from physical layer all the way to application layer. So layer 3 is the network layer, and that's where in the previous slide I was showing that another AWS service, that AWS Shield Advanced, that provide protection at a network layer level. The AWS WAF, which we are using in this example, provide the protection at a application layer. So let's first configure the IP set for our use case. I'm gonna name this IP set as allowed IP contact API, and then I'm gonna provide a description which is optional, but I'm just gonna provide a description saying whitelisted IP for contact API. And then I'm picking the IP4 or IP6. I'm gonna pick IPv4. I am listing one IP here, but there can be a CIDR block or the multiple IP address in this IP set. We're gonna click on create IP set. And once our IP set is created, next step is that we're gonna configure our WebACL and rule for the use case. So let's create the WebACL and fill in the detail. So here is how the screen will look like for the configuration. I'm gonna select the regional resource here because I want to integrate the WebACL or associate it with the Amazon API Gateway. I'm gonna pick a region US East and I'm gonna name it as contact WebACL. And then I'm gonna provide a description which is optional here and also the CloudWatch matrix name. Next, we will create the rule. Now, AWS WAF provide ability to create your own rules and rule group or pick a manage rule. We're gonna create our own. So I'm gonna select add my own rule and rule group. I'm gonna use the visual editor to build this rule. Other option is to just build the JSON in the JSON format, but I'm using the visual editor. So here I'm gonna name the rule contact API WAF rule. I have the option to build it as a regular rule or a rate-based rule. We have already done rate-based rule in the previous workshop, so I'm gonna focus on regular rule here. So I'm selecting regular rule. And then here I'm providing the rule condition. And in this rule condition, I'm gonna select the IP set that we created in the previous step. So my condition is that, hey, if it doesn't match the statement not originate from the IP address and in this IP set, right? Source IP address. So basically what I'm saying is that if it doesn't, be in part of that IP set, then my action will be to block the request. And that's really why I'm picking this action as block. So that's my rule. Now, when you create the rule and rule group, it's gonna tell you that how many WCU you're gonna use. WCU, which is the web ACL capacity unit, it's a measurement unit, and number of WCU consumed depend on the complexity of rule configured. Now in this example, it's only consuming 1 WCU. We have allocated 5,000 for the account. Now we need to configure an action for the scenario when requests don't match any configure rule. So this is an overarching action. So in this, we want to allow all other scenarios. So we're gonna just use the default action as allow. If I have multiple rule configured, then I can adjust the priority of those rules. But in this particular use case, I only have one rule, the contact API WAF rule. So I'm gonna leave it as it is, and in the next few steps I can configure CloudWatch metrics and request sampling, and then rule is fully configured. It's going to show me a review of all the configuration that I have completed, and then I click on create and my web ACL will be created and will be ready to use. Once it is ready to use, I want to validate that it is working as designed. Actually, before I do that, I have to associate it with the my resource, which I did not do. So here, this screen, I'm associating it with the API gateway. And in that, once I go there, it's going to show that all the API endpoint that all the APIs actually that I have in this region. So I'm going to pick the contact API because that's the API that I want to protect using the AWS WAF. So I will associate this API with this WAF rule that we just created. Now that web ACL is associated with the API gateway and I selected the API, will validate that it is working as per the use case, as per the design or not. So I'm going to use Postman, can use any tool. The end goal here is to basically invoke the API endpoint. So I'm providing the API endpoint here. And this is my endpoint, this is my request, and this, if you see the response, is 403, and this is basically a response that I will see if I'm invoking it from an IP not whitelisted, right? So that's the goal, that we should get a 403 forbidden, and that's what basically my validation is telling me, that hey, I can't access it, it's forbidden. And that's happening because of the WAF association that I have with this API. If I remove the WAF association, or if I use an IP that is actually in my IP set, then I will not see this 403 forbidden, rather I will see the response actually being returned from the API. So at this point, it's all working, and since it's a workshop, so we can clean up the resources so that you don't incur charges in your AWS account. So you can remove the association, delete the rule, delete the ACL, and then delete the IP set. And this is just part of the cleanup resources, just so that these resources are not sitting in the account and incurring the hourly and monthly charges associated with these resources. So with this workshop, we successfully demonstrated how to implement IP whitelisting using AWS WAF. IP whitelisting is a standard security practice employed by enterprises to secure resources. It can also be combined with other rules to create a multi-layered security approach. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I'm constantly working on new content covering various AWS topics, so please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Cloud with Girish channel. Your support helps me continue creating valuable AWS tutorial and workshop. Stay tuned for more exciting content. Thanks for watching.